All right. We're going to have a quick design 101, which is about 25 minutes. We're going to go through the different types of mockups, wireframes, etc., what they can be used for, high-level strategies for how we can make them, and then why they're useful and how we can use them to make sure that our technical products are better in the end. And we'll have a little bit of time for questions, and then we'll go through an exercise together using Figma. Cool. So let's talk about what is UI UX design, because UI and UX are some words that are thrown around a lot. And whenever you have words like that, well, I don't know, things can get muddled or definitions can become buzzwords. So essentially, thinking about the UI side of things, these are some terminologies that we're going to focus on today that are tools that we can use to help us in our UX processes. So we have kind of like a sketch. And a sketch is essentially a basic drawing of your app that you might put on a napkin or just to quickly express your ideas. We have then a wireframe, which is a step up from a sketch. So once you have a sketch that you really like, you'd have a wireframe, which represents your app with basic shapes and layouts. You might have some text in there, but you don't really have any colors. It's really just focused on functionality. Afterwards, you have a mockup, which is a lot like if you've ever seen a prototype that looks like a finished website, but is not actually coded. This is what it is. And then a prototype adds to that by adding layers of interaction, usually supplemented by some kind of program like Figma. Additionally, I will just point out, as I said, we'll have time for questions at the end, but if there are any big questions, feel free to raise your hand in the Zoom call and point it out.
Also, feel free to throw them in the chat. We'll answer them.
Yeah.
So just want to add thank you guys for taking the time to learn a bit about design. Just as Joe said, design is a very large field, and we only covered a very small sliver of it, UX and UI. Hopefully you guys learned a bit about how to use Figma, how it could be used to really improve the whole process of making software in general. It's a lot more than just coding it, right? At the end of the day, a human is going to use this, and it's well time spent if you take the time to iterate on the process. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you again.
One more quick thing about next steps. Yeah, thank you again, Joe and Jose, so much for being this. We'll be sending an email out soon with some, we'll include this presentation, we'll include some other resources that will help you out in your journey. We also are starting like an Oasis knowledge repository too. We'll be launching that pretty soon, but that will all come out. What's next? So someone asked about how do you code this? So the next couple Oasis workshops, you're gonna be looking into that. So next week we have Intro to the Web. You're gonna be learning about HTML and CSS. So how do you take these designs and actually turn them into code you can launch? After that, we're going to be going to Intro Front-End Dev. This one's a collaboration with Cosmo, just like we're collaborating with Scout on this one. We're collaborating with Cosmo, the computer science mentoring organization. And they're going to be talking to us about React code. And so those two are coming up same time, same place, same day, but yeah, one and 2 weeks from now. And before you head out, I think that some few people may have already headed out, but if you're still here, we'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear kind of what you thought about this, any suggestions you might have. This QR code should do the trick. Also, I can let me go ahead and drop a link here in the chat if you don't have a phone on you to scan this with. But we'd love to hear what you guys thought about it. There's the link. We got a lot of good feedback from last week. We actually look at it and use it to like improve it. Although I know some people commented on my microphone, I'm still working on getting that fixed. So sorry about that. The quality's not too good on my end. Let's see, and yeah, I think Jose is also working on that too. So we'll work on that. But thank you again. If you have any other questions, we'll be sticking around for a little bit. Feel free to unmute yourself or throw. See you next time. Thanks, guys. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you all for coming.
Hello.
Yeah, there's the form. Sorry.
Hello. Can I ask you guys a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I was looking at the Scout website, and I think it's really cool what they're doing. I'm actually looking for. I'm not really into the design, right? But I'm looking for a project to learn data visualization.
So here's an example of a sketch, which is also sometimes referred to as a low fidelity design. As I said, they're usually monochrome, they focus on the big picture, and they're quick and easy to create. So you can see here that, there is a good example of how hierarchy is working. We have an understanding of like the big details, so we know the names of the pages and things like that, but we don't see any images, we don't see any of that extra text that may pertain to the data that later lives in the application. And we can demonstrate how the application flows together. And this is really the point of it. And through this process, you can really get pretty far in designing because you can see right up front, this doesn't really work, it's confusing, and this works better. This is an example of a wireframe, which is a medium fidelity design, additionally. So you can see here now that we have more information. In a sketch, we might not have this like description about the artist. We might not have text here. We can see what's clickable. We can see what form fields are. It doesn't look like the prettiest thing in the world, but that's okay. Because if we were to give this to somebody, they could try to complete a task or give us feedback on the design that would be useful and educate our later designs. And so, yeah, often these are created using a software tool like Figma, but also if you're good at drawing and you have a ruler, you can totally do this on paper as well. And then this is something like a mock-up, which is a high fidelity design. So you can see like all of the colors are worked out. We have some images. This is pretty much what we would hand off to the developers if we were to be satisfied with this. And this is a good opportunity to, you can use these things to get feedback on functionality, but additionally, you can also get feedback on how your app looks, whether it's accessible to people, are these colors too bright, are the design choices that you made making the design more difficult to understand and use. So these are all really good, useful things. And as I said, yeah, they serve different stages of the design process, and we'll talk about that more later. Cool. So now we're just going to dive into some justification as to why we design before we code, because a lot of the time it's really tempting to just kind of sit down and get started. But I guarantee you that overall, design will save you a lot of time, a lot of thinking, and in the end, make your app quite a bit better, even at a pretty basic level. You don't have to be a crazy advanced designer to really change the roadmap of your technical project for the better. So the first major reason is that wireframes and mockups make it fast and easy to test out new product ideas. And it's far quicker than programming a new page or feature. To give you an example, let's say we're making like a different type of social media network, right? And we're making it for a mobile phone. If we have paper sketches, we can say, hey, what do you think about this basic paper sketch, which might be something like a newsfeed? Someone could take a look at it and say, I don't really know if that search bar makes a lot of sense. It doesn't really seem to have a purpose on this page. And you're like, oh, cool, no problem. You erase the search bar in your sketch and you hand them a new one. They're like, yeah, I like that better, right? As opposed to if you were coding the project and for the first time you worked on it really hard and then you gave it to someone and they're like, yeah, I don't like the search bar. And you're like, oh, good, I have to recode that now. So much, much faster. Additionally, it's great to communicate the design to others because at the end of the day, whatever you're making is likely going to be used by people. And you want to make sure that the people that you're making this for have an easy time using it and like to use it. So demonstrating what the design looks like up front can get you easy and early feedback on, yeah, I'd like to use this, or no, it's not that much better than X or Y or Z. And also, if you're ever like in the case of talking about your past projects or talking about technical projects that you're working on, it's a lot better that if you can say, yeah, I'm working on this website. It's not totally done yet, but I have this completed prototype so you can see what it looks like. And I have these 2 pages completed and I'm working later. But basically, it's always something to show. And then lastly, if you're working in a team, it's a really good way to split work up among team members. This is something that's super important to the success of Scout projects because designers doing the work with branding and UX and wireframes, that takes virtually like full time of the Scout commitment. And then the developers are busy at work doing a litany of other things. They're not just coding the interface, they're working on researching the tech stack, making sure that all the features are accounted for. They're working on the API layer and the connections, setting up backends, all these different stuff that if everybody was tasked with doing the same thing, it would be really hard. But wireframes are a really good place for the designers and the developers to meet in the middle and have something that they can agree on and both work towards. So definitely a good delegation tool. And I think Jose is going to tell us a little bit about his experience of using mockups in Sandbox and his personal projects. So go ahead.
Yeah, so similar to, as Joe was saying, it really saves a lot of time. Coding is a pretty time-intensive process, and as long as you want to reduce that time you're coding, right? Because you want to make a product that's ultimately going to be used by human. And so just framing sketches really reduces that time and ultimately just lets you make better products, better things, better looking things, better usable things. And at the end of the day, a lot about design is a very human focused field, and mockups allow you to really focus on the person who's going to start using your product instead of how you're going to code it up. Don't worry about the implementation details, right? Worry about the actual experience of using a product. And that's why I use mockups a lot for, and a lot of designers do them.
Yeah. Let me share. Cool. Yeah, absolutely. Pretty much any situation in which you're working with the developers, if you see that there's not a designer dedicated to doing this, it's a red flag. You definitely want to be aware. And having these skills as a developer will...
My internet connection just went off, I think, right?
Sorry, Jose, could you say that again?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I'll say it again, but could you hear me now? Just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just saying, just mockups reduce the amount of time you have to be coding something. And allows you to not have to worry about these implementation details. Because it's a lot of thinking how to implement something, right? And when you don't have to worry about implementation details, you can worry about the actual experience of using your product or software. And software is ultimately going to be used by a human being. And I think it's important to focus on the person who's using it at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. All right, great. So now we're just going to hop into some high-level strategies about how we create designs and the different types of wireframes and mockups and things like that. By and large, depending on what you're doing, you're going to use a different set of tools. So when you're starting out, honestly, the best format that I think is creating low-fidelity wireframes on paper. Paper is just fast. It's easy. There's not a lot of investment in it. A lot of the time, people are afraid to show their designs because they put a lot of work into creating a really pretty prototype or a mock-up, but then they are worried that people won't like it. They'll say it's ugly, things like that. Part of the process is getting through that, but with you know, like a pencil and paper sketch, there's not a lot of investment anyway, and again, they're really easy to iterate on. So this is actually a great example. So this is the original sketches for the Oasis workshop website. So you can see it's not what it is today, but the basic structure is there, the information is there, and this is really great because if someone were to work together at this on a table, it's like, oh, well, maybe we should have a box that says workshops or weekly workshops, and maybe we should have like a sign up thing, right? So it's a good way to come together about it. Yeah, so they're very easy to make. The designs can be iterated on quickly, and people will often be honest too. Not only is it easier to present them, people are less, more inclined to just critique it honestly, as opposed to sensing that you put a lot of work into this and you are still sort of a little defensive of it. So hopefully not, but yeah, you might get some more honest feedback. Cool. So then creating medium and high fidelity wireframes generally exist with the same tool set. So often they're made with computer software. Earlier you saw that sort of boxes and lines one. This is definitely more high fidelity since we're including typefaces, we have colors, the buttons have shapes, things like that. But software like Figma is really great for making these because if you are not super confident in making your own components or your own UI, there are plenty of UI kits out there that allow you to utilize pre-made components to make really nice layouts. And likewise, if you are interested in learning how to make your own, it's a great place to learn. And that's partly what we'll be doing today. So yeah, this is a mock-up for the Oasis site, and then we have a wireframe that's more mid-fidelity of some like generic social app that just shows the structure of information, things like that. So they're more representative of the look and feel of the app, which then again allows for more useful feedback. There's this bullet point in not requiring a facilitator since the user flow is mostly accounted for. That's a word that we use when we're talking about prototyping with paper sketches and doing user testing. So we'll go into user testing later and I'll give some more context there. But yeah, you essentially can, using Figma, hook these prototypes up to make like this button goes to this screen, which is really useful because you can simulate that experience of using it. So Jose, if you want to describe like a typical experience of creating the design and like your research process and the tools you use and things like
that. Hopefully I don't cut off this time. But as I mentioned before, and I think just as Joe kind of pointed out, the whole user flow, you just want to make sure your user could correctly use your actual product, right? And that comes with a lot of research beforehand too. Research can include everything from interviewing your users, defining who your user actually is, testing your wireframes, your paper prototypes. A lot of that generates a lot of important information that could be used to form your mockups and higher fidelity designs. So once you move on to these higher fidelity designs, you could continue iterating and iterating, and design's a lot of iteration. At least in my experience, it's been a lot of iteration. Yeah, once you actually get to a product that serves your purpose that you were intending to do originally. Somehow cut off again.
I think we heard everything you said though, which is good. And yeah, I definitely agree with it. Later on, I'll talk a little bit more about how the Scout process works and how we go through the design thinking process and research and eventually start creating wireframes because they're very critical and they really help the experience as they are super iterative and we can change our direction and stay flexible. Okay, so now we're just going to dive into what the functions of mockups are and some strategies for user testing and the different types. So first thing is user testing. Exposing your designs to feedback is so important. Nobody will use your app if it does not work well or if it is not easy to use. Especially a lot of the time, unless you're making something really, really different than other technical projects, I think a lot of the things that you see today with new technical projects are improvements on things in existing fields. So Figma is actually an amazing example. The big prototyping software used to be Sketch, and Figma added like a layer of better user experience on top of Sketch and then put it in the web browser. And that's why it's so popular. If you're interested in things like Notion, the note-taking app, note-taking apps have been around forever. There are a lot of similar ones, but Notion has advantages and is doing well in the market because their UX is so good. So user testing is really important to make sure that your app can do the things that you want it to do. So for sketches, this is the part where the facilitator comes in. So ideally when you do user testing, and I'll go into this a little bit later as well, you have a set of tasks. Basically when somebody is using your app or your website, you want them to be able to do something on it. And maybe multiple things. So you want to write those tasks out and then create the most basic user interface that you can think of, like you can see here on this iPad, that allows people to achieve those tasks. And this will educate your later designs. So obviously, if you're clicking buttons on a piece of paper, they're not actually going to move. So the facilitator comes in and says like, hello, thank you for participating today. Could you please go through these 5 tasks and I will like give you a new piece of paper when you tap something to see what the interaction is. And people, yeah, this is great because people will be honest. There'd be less confusion about the tasks themselves. You get feedback on the functionality of your app. And again, it's very quick. Yeah, you understand that if the flow makes sense, is the layout appealing. You might focus a little bit less on content in this phase. As you can see, like this one has some pieces, but a lot of the time it'd be scribbles, but yeah, either way. So for medium fidelity designs, again, you're lacking major design details, so you just kind of have basic shapes. You're not worrying about colors, and this is good because you want it to be accessible and for people just to focus on the functionality and the flows. And this is good because you can also then bring this into Figma and you don't have to be the facilitator anymore. You just hook up your prototype and you say, please go through this onboarding flow that's shown here. And yeah, it's a good start. And then it's pretty easy to transition from these mid-fidelity wireframes to high-fidelity wireframes with a little bit of styling.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When do you begin writing the code in the medium fidelity designs?
That's an excellent question. So I'll give the example of Scout, I would say, because Scout has tricky timelines because we're doing a whole project in 3 months and you don't really get the designs until about halfway through the project. And you certainly don't get high fidelity wireframes until like 2 months into the project. So generally what I recommend is, say you have 3 months as a developer and you know that you're gonna that's gonna be your situation. Spending that first month and a half, think about the features and those tasks that we saw a couple slides ago, right? Thinking about these tasks, take a high level approach and say like, all right, what other things than just the website interface am I going to be thinking about here, right? Like what other parts do I have to code? Do I have to code some API calls? Do I have to set up a database and connect it to a website? And that will take up a lot of your time. And when you are ready and you have all of that set up, all of the rest of your website will be ready to integrate with that data. And then once you have probably about mid-fidelity designs, I think that's when you can start confidently coding the front end. Because at that point, the functionality of the wireframes has been validated through user testing. People are feeling pretty confident that this is the layout that they want. And later on, you can pretty much just, you can code these kind of like basic components that don't really have any styling. And in the last part of your project, just focus on making it look pretty, you know, adding animations, adding different fonts, different colors. And it's mostly just kind of like aesthetic stuff. So to review, the timeline is like, if you were given a 3-month timeline, first month and a half, do your planning, break down what the app is about, do all of your other stuff. At that month and a half point, you'll get some medium fidelity wireframes. You can start coding on those, not worrying about styling, but being confident about structure. And then finally, you can spend your last month adding animations, colors, whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does.
Cool, awesome. Yeah, and then so user, hop into user testing in a bit, but user testing is largely the same for the high fidelity designs. I think the additional aspect is that you want to ask questions about how the app looks and things like that to make sure it's accessible and legible and things like that. Yeah. So just going back to the tips for user testing, definitely create a specific set of tasks for the user to perform and have those tasks be like the core functionality of your application or program. Like it really needs to do these things in order to be successful. And then observe the user performing those tasks on your prototype without any guidance. So if they get stuck, don't immediately help them. Like note where they get stuck and ask why they got confused, because that's a point of your design that you're going to need to improve. And then afterwards, improve your prototype based on feedback. You can ask them questions about like, their other experiences and their other thoughts in a sort of semi-structured interview. But by and large, yeah, you're looking to observe their experience. And it just actually sort of said Scout's process for performing user testing and design iteration. So I won't say it all again, but yeah, I'd say like the one thing that I didn't really mention in there at that point is basically user testing doesn't just start with wireframes. It starts with the beginning of the research process. So as a developer, you want to be communicating about what features you think are going to be in your application, communicating about the technical choices you're making, getting feedback on all of those choices. And then once you're moving into wireframing, starting with paper prototyping, like do that really basic stuff. Think about the tasks that you need. Sorry, my friend's outside. And yeah, like basically there's user testing at every point during the process, and you want to be really sure that you're on top of it and doing it well. So yeah, ultimately, goal of your mockup is to find out if your design solves the right problems. So once you have an idea, it's just kind of time to design. So this design process is kind of like a high level of what I just said. So you're coming up with your idea, you're brainstorming the features, you're validating those features, talking to your friends about them. They say like, no, I don't think we need to have a search feature or anything like that. Creating your basic sketch, testing it on your peers and users, improve it from feedback, repeat, then move up a level of fidelity, go into Figma, do your medium fidelity stuff, test it on users, improve, repeat, better mockup. It's just really a big cycle. And it can take a long time and it can be kind of arduous, but it's definitely worth it in the end. The more you do it, the better your app will be at the end of the day. Yeah, so that's kind of the summary of it. So the last thing we just have to go over is today we're going to be working with Figma. So Figma is probably the most popular sketching library right now. Sketching library or prototyping program. You might have heard of other ones like Sketch, which is a desktop application. Adobe has a product called Adobe XD. Then there's also like InVision. These are all great, but Figma is really nice as it's super collaborative. It's free for students, and it's can do pretty much everything that you would need out of a wireframing tool. Okay, cool. Questions?
So before we start the questions really quick, so as Joe mentioned, we're gonna hop right into Figma. If you haven't had a chance to do so yet, now's a good time to make a Figma account. And actually we have a starter code that you're gonna be using for this next part after the question. So we're gonna take about 5 minutes now. If you have that, if any of you have that, feel free to just like ask questions. If not, I just threw a link in the chat to our GitHub repository where we have instructions for making your Figma account and then downloading that starter code and importing it. It's all super easy if you have any questions from the chat. Otherwise, feel free to ask questions. We're gonna set about 5 minutes for questions about design or about getting set up there.
Anything.
Yeah, so someone in the chat has a question about the difference between testing and unknown versus medium high fidelity mockups / sketches.
Sorry, I'm trying to get it. I might. The Zoom chat.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to take that one?
Yeah, let me just stop the video in case if that's like potentially right. So the difference between testing and a low fidelity okay, yeah, it is. Sorry, I have spotty internet connection issues today, so sometimes I'll think that I'm going off the internet. But low fidelity mockups basically allow you to really get more honest feedback from users. That's just because, as Joe mentioned before, a lot of less effort has been gone into the actual making process. So people are more willing to give you honest feedback. You could test more things more quickly, which allows you to iterate more just faster, and hopefully generate better ideas. And then once you actually have a concrete set of ideas, you can move on to testing your higher fidelity mockups and really get into the nitty-gritty of the design. You could really test about, at that point, like the placement of a button, right? Can a user quickly navigate to a navigation bar, right? You could really get into the details of the design. So the main difference is how detailed you could get feedback, how detailed your feedback is. At different stages of the design process you want. different detail in your feedback.
Yeah.
I think that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Just really the beginning parts are focusing on functionality, sheer functionality, nothing else. And then as you get more complex and visual, you start getting different types of feedback on how your thing looks and things like that. I saw another question, do you design mobile view first or desktop first or both? That's a really, really great question. So depending on what you're making, so let's say you're making a website, one thing to make sure that you are doing the entire time is thinking about how you can make your website responsive. So you can kind of start wherever you want. There is this like tip that was going around for a long time that you definitely want to start with mobile first and then make your design larger up to a website. But honestly, in my experience, I found that you can go either way, but in most situations, you'll have to make some adjustments. But say you're like making the Oasis website or something like that, right? You would make some sketches of the desktop part itself, and then you'd probably make some sketches of a smaller screen, maybe like a tablet size, and then you make some sketches of the phone as well. And this is really, really important in this day and age because everybody is doing literally everything on their phones. I could be on my phone right now. You don't even know. So like, yeah, great question. And definitely try to do them all at once and test them all at once. Because if you leave one for the end, you might bite yourself by realizing you can't really display something well on mobile or on web or on tablet.
Can I add something at the end of that?
Yeah, please.
Also, I agree with that. And also just depends on what the product you're building is for, right? If it's an application only being used on a desktop, then maybe don't invest any time on mobile version because it's not going to be used there. So always think about the actual place for display, what the product's going to be used.
Yeah, absolutely. Good points. Yeah, it's a tricky part, but it's a good part. So are the pre-designed elements on Figma free? Do you have to give credits for using it? Yes, they are free. So Figma has a thing called community. It's like in a tab in the top left, you'll see it when you open it. And if you click it, you can search for UI component kits. As for accreditation, that's actually a good question. I don't know. I think there's probably one thing you could check is that on the like homepage for the community or the community page for the UI kit you want to use, I assume there'll be some kind of license or fair usage thing that you can read. But otherwise, I would take a look. I would Google that, say like Figma UI kit accreditation, because I do know that a lot of sites like the Noun Project, which is a good website for finding icons, you do have to provide accreditation to the authors there, as that's the situation. So, and do you start from a blank page for mockups, or do you start from a boilerplate template? Also up to you. I think a lot of it depends on like how custom you want to get with it. Like there are, as you know, using a component library is sort of taking away a level of customization because there's a little bit locked into what those look like unless you want to change them. So I find that like when I was starting out, I would use more templates, I would use more component libraries, and I'd just get a sense of creating good user flows and a good user experience and not worrying too much about my own skills with creating aesthetics. And then as I got more interested in design, I started making my own stuff and doing it my own way based on what I had seen from the components and the templates in the past. So it's kind of just like, you know, building off of your past knowledge and experiences and, as always, good examples of design.